Okay, that looks about right. Situated. And we are going to begin because I have a 7 o'clock meeting. So I want to make sure we have enough time. I hope everybody is doing well this afternoon. Today we are going to talk about tefillot and Berachot, or prayer and blessing. There is some overlap between these two topics, as you might guess. Blessings are often part of prayers, but prayer has a very specific meaning as well in Judaism, as we will discover. But we're going to start off with the topic of why are we praying at all? What does that mean in a Jewish context? And what do we think we are about, that we are doing? So prayer in the official capacity in Judaism really is a vital component of connecting with God. As we see in this particular section of the Torah readings, where we are building the Mishkan, connecting with God in physical, earthly acts is very, very important. And in fact, it is from the example of the sacrifices that took place first in the desert and then at the altar in Jerusalem that we understand how important it is for us to have regular connection with God. Now, we don't have the sacrifices anymore, and we are going to talk about how we can proceed in the current situation, current meaning the last 2,000 years. So first of all, understand that our rabbis taught back in Berachot 2,000 years ago that the world stands on three things: on Torah, on avodah, and gimilut chasadim, usually translated as acts of loving kindness. The idea of the world resting upon this three-legged tripod, which is providing stability, upon Torah, which shouldn't need much additional explanation, or upon acts of kindness, which again should be fairly self-evident that this is essential for the world. But this word avodah is a little bit more unclear. The word avodah literally means service. But what kind of service? Well, it is a word that was used to describe the sacrifices of the temple, but it is also a word that has been used to describe the service of prayer. So we see already that there is an overlap here of the term being used, as well as an understanding of the importance, regardless of which way you want to translate it. Indeed, our rabbis say that it is an obligation for us to pray each day. As we see from the Talmud here in Ta'anit, it is a positive commandment to pray each day, as it is stated, and you shall serve, there's our word service again, the Lord your God. They taught that avodah means prayer. As it is stated, now from Deuteronomy, and you shall serve him, la'avdo, which again comes from that same root word, with all your heart. The sages asked, what is the service of the heart? This is prayer. So they are looking at the usage of the word in multiple locations, which is typical of how we are taught to read the Torah and the Tanakh, the rest of the Bible, and noticing that the word avodah does not only mean the service of the altar and sacrifice, but that the word avodah also can mean a service of the heart. And with that understanding, we then ask, what is the service of the heart? Prayer is the most logical understanding of that. And indeed, even before the rabbis, we see an understanding, a hint of this, well, perhaps stronger than a hint, from the book of Psalms, in this case, Psalm 51. O Lord, open my lips, and my mouth shall declare your praise. In fact, this phrase is one that is still included as a private statement right before we begin prayer, in particular what we call the Amidah. For you do not delight in sacrifice, else I would give it. You take no pleasure in burnt offering. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise. So there's a little bit of an interesting contrast here between the sacrifices of fire and animals and the sacrifice of our heart. And what the psalmist is trying to tell us is that doing a sacrifice without meaning, without intention, without any emotion is pointless. And likewise, doing a prayer with the same passion and intention that a person should have when they were doing the sacrifices, when those were available to us, that in fact has at least as good of consequence in our relationship and connection to God. So this is giving us a strong indication that it was not only a mechanical action that took place on the altar that affected our relationship with God, but instead it was a deeper connection that was brought about through the emotional, spiritual movement, which the altar merely represented. It was merely a vehicle for that to be achieved. But the psalmist continues, "Do good in your favor to Zion, build the walls of Jerusalem, then you will delight in the sacrifices of righteousness, in burnt offerings and whole offerings. Then they will offer bullocks upon your altar." So after having just said that God doesn't delight in sacrifices, now the psalmist is saying that there will be a restoration and God will delight in those sacrifices. The way that we understand this apparent contradiction is to see that the first sacrifices were offered as empty gestures, whereas the later sacrifices, as they go along with the sacrifice of righteousness, are instead supporting our proper connection and relationship to God. So sacrifices are not a problem by themselves, but they also require the emotion that should be part of our prayer too. So we are seeing this connection, this tight understanding of sacrifices and prayer as being very similar in purpose of building our relationship with God. Any questions on that connection before we move forward? It's just very, very important to understand that in Judaism, the foundation of our prayer is very parallel to the foundation of the sacrifices. And indeed, prayer has replaced sacrifices since they are not able to be done. And indeed, sacrifices never replaced prayer, that is to say, the content of our heart, even when they were in existence. Sacrifices were never meant to be mechanical, and so too, you can imagine, prayer is not meant to be mechanical. We see additional teachings within the Tanakh, within the Bible, about this relationship. From Hosea 14, "Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled in your iniquity. Take with you words and return to the Lord. Say to him, forgive all iniquity and accept that which is good. So we will render for bullocks the offering of our lips." Take words, the offering of our lips. Again, Hosea is talking about people praying to God rather than offering sacrifices. And then from 2 Kings 8, "If they sin against you, for there is no one that sins not, and you be angry with them and deliver them to the enemy, and they carry them away captive to the land of the enemy, yet they turn back and return to you with all their heart and with all their soul, and pray to you toward their land, and hear their prayer and their supplication in heaven, your dwelling place, and maintain their cause." So we know that sacrifices could not be offered outside the land of Israel once Jerusalem had been established. So what are people sacrificing here? They are praying, they are giving their words, they are letting their hearts pour out. And that is considered effective. That is the core of what happens during a prayer service. So we see even within the Bible, even during the time of the temple, even during the time when the altar was the centerpiece of Jewish life, prayer and the emotion of prayer, the emotion of connection and of reaching out to God was central to how everything was considered and thought of in Jewish life. And even though the altar was destroyed, the function, the prayer, that has not been damaged. And in fact, in order to tie this connection a little bit more closely, the prayer services that we maintain in a regular Jewish day, in a regular Jewish life, are actually attached to the times of the temple sacrifices. As we see here from Rambam, from Mishnah Torah, the great law code of 1,000 years ago. The Great Assembly, one of the earliest groups of Jewish leaders in the time after the return from Babylon. The Great Assembly also established that the number of prayers would correspond to the number of times the daily sacrifices were offered in the temple. Therefore, 2 daily prayers were instituted, corresponding to the daily offerings. as well as an additional service corresponding to the third offering, which was brought on special occasions. The morning prayer is called shacharit, the afternoon prayer is called mincha, and the additional prayer service for special occasions is called musaf. The special occasions include Shabbat and the holidays. The Great Assembly also established that there would be one prayer service in the evening, called Mariv or Arvit, since parts of the afternoon service would be consumed on the altar throughout the night. And indeed, this is where we learn that we have 3 prayer services on a typical Jewish day: the evening service, the morning and afternoon. And on Shabbat and other holidays, we add an additional service called Musaf to correspond to that. Whenever you are in a service, most specifically, for example, Shabbat, which is the most familiar to people, recognize that when we do the section of the service called the Amidah, called the prayer itself, that we are patterning our occasion over the sacrifices of the temple. And this is one of the explanations why, for example, on Shabbat morning, you will see the same prayers repeated twice. They're not actually being repeated. Certain portions, yes, are the same, but the content of the middle, the core of the prayer is still different, although we usually do that privately, and some may not have recognized that. But each time we do it, we are hearkening back to that activity of the temple, and very democratically, we are all now participating in it. The daily sacrifices that were managed by the temple in the past were done by only the Kohanim, only by the priests, whereas the prayers that we do in the present, and have for 2,000 years plus, are done by each individual, making it, as I said, a much more democratic and participatory activity. Questions or comments? All right, so let's talk about what's actually happening to us as we engage in our prayer. The following quote's taken from the Kusari, written by Yehuda Halevi. And this expression should be conducive with his thoughts, not adding to them. And in his prayer, he does not express himself by rote, like a starling, a type of bird that's just parroting things, or parrot. Rather, each word is contemplated and intended. When we go through our prayers, we are not merely reciting the sounds. Each word should be creating a new thought, a new feeling, a new expression from within us. A person's prayer provides nourishment for his soul, just as food provides nourishment for his body. The influence of each prayer remains with the person until the subsequent prayer, just like the daytime meal sustains him until he eats the evening meal. So it's a beautiful metaphor that by praying in this regular pattern, you are feeding the body in a way, feeding the soul in a way that is similar to the feeding of the body. And just as our body needs actual food, bread and such, so too our soul needs nourishment. And the time to break and to nourish the soul is during these scheduled moments of prayer, which, as I said, are 3 different times on a regular weekday and a bonus time on Shabbat and holidays. And that allows us to have this experience frequently enough that we do not become starved for that soulful, that spiritual activity. And returning to our theme of the similarity between prayer and sacrifice, we take from one of the chief rabbis of England, which is Rabbi Lord Jacobitz. Like sacrifices, prayer is intended to change man, not God. Very, very important on that. Right? Both the sacrifices and prayer are not there to twist God's arm. They're not there to convince God of something that God is opposed to. They are there to change us. Its purpose is to cultivate a contrite heart, to be humble and to be regretful of that which we've done that is wrong, to promote feelings of humility and inadequacy in man, not inadequacy in a negative sense, but inadequacy to balance out our arrogance. That next to God and next to the enormity of the universe, we are quite small and thus need to reach out, whilst encouraging reliance on divine assistance, for that is where we direct ourselves. Through prayer, the worshiper becomes chastened, gains moral strength, and intensifies the quest of spirituality, thereby turning into a person worthy of response to his pleas. So by changing ourselves, we change our position within the world, and we recognize the change of the world around us. Now, sometimes that just means changing our point of view and recognizing what is already there. Sometimes that means changing our direction so that we are able to encounter and see opportunities and experiences that otherwise would have been missed if we had not opened ourselves up to this divine assistance of changing ourselves. So prayer is an incredibly transformative action, and it is something, again, done frequently enough to help keep us on the right path. The same way that a person who is trying to change themselves through a change of diet, or change themselves through a change of exercise, or to pick up and adopt a new habit, whether it be learning a language or another skill, will find that frequency of touching on the point of change is a great reinforcer. So too, frequency of prayer will provide a constant revitalization of this process and allow you to begin to see a transformation little by little of yourself. Again, we're not trying to change God. God is unchangeable, as we talked about way back in our first couple of classes. But we can certainly change ourselves. Now, with all of that in mind, you may be thankful to know that we don't just tell people, all right, off you go, enjoy praying, but instead there is a structure for our prayer. There is indeed an order to our prayer, a siddur, which is also called a prayer book. Now, the modern prayer book is quite long, but it's important to understand that it is the growth of centuries, and the core of it is still quite small. If you look at our usual Shabbat prayer book, for example, Lev Shalem, you will notice that only a small portion of the page is taken up with the prayer. The rest is either with translation or with commentary. If you were to reduce it only to the prayer itself in its most concise form, a prayer book can easily fit into a moderately sized pamphlet that will fit into your pocket. Of course, nowadays we're even luckier. We can fit much more onto one of these and take our prayers and indeed a Jewish library with us wherever we go. So to understand the structure of this prayer book and how the prayers are laid out, let us turn to the teachings of our sages. In the morning, one says 2 blessings before the Shema and 1 afterwards, and at night 2 before and 2 afterwards, 1 long and 1 short. Wherever they said to prolong, make it a long one may not shorten. To shorten, one may not lengthen, prolong. To seal, one must seal. Not to seal, one must not seal. All right, now if that sounds a little confusing, yes, the Mishnah from which this is taken is a shorthand set of notes that is meant to help you recall what to do, not meant to teach you it from scratch. Instead, we rely on the explanation of our teachers, or somebody like Rav Amram Gaon, one of the great teachers, as you can see, from the 9th century. The order of prayers and Berachot for the entire year that you requested, that has been shown to us by heaven, we deem appropriate to set forth and lay out in the manner in which the tradition was passed down to us, as compiled by the rabbis during the period of the Mishnah and the Gemara. This is the introduction to a letter that he wrote to a distant community that asked for more concrete listings of exactly how the prayers were meant to look. To say 1 before and 1 after, it's very confusing, but to give at least some examples of how these words are meant to be put into shape, that was very, very helpful. But as you can see, it was only in the 9th century that this companion compilation, this edited version of the words that have been familiar and found expressive within the community was finally written down. And before that, prayer was much more flexible, meaning each person who got up to lead the service would often find their own words within the structure as described by the Mishnah at the top of the page, but the content would be very much up to the individual. In fact, the individual expression was very, very important, as we see from the following texts. It is taught Rabbi Yossi said, anyone who changes the prescribed formula instituted by the sages for blessings has not fulfilled his obligation. Rabbi Meir says, even if one said, blessed is the one who created this thing, it is so beautiful, he has fulfilled his obligation. So there was an argument, as you can imagine, where some people argued that the prayer had to be said in a very, very precise and never changing formula. And there were others who said, really, the prayer can be said in any way you like as long as the intention is correct. What eventually happens within Judaism is that we settle down into a happy medium. Rabbi Yaakov ben Aha said in the name of Shmuel, the law follows Rabbi Meir, meaning the more free-form expression. An incident involving Rav supports this ruling. A certain Persian came to Rav and said, what about me? I do not know how to make a proper blessing. So when I eat bread, I say, blessed is the one who created this bread. Have I fulfilled my obligation? Rav said, yes. So certainly a person should be encouraged, as we'll see later on, to follow some of the formulas and for very good reasons of spiritual guidance. But the essence of prayer, and later as we'll see of blessing, is to express the gratitude, to express that part of our soul that is yearning to recognize that this experience is amazing, or that we wish to be connected to the divine more deeply. If we can best accomplish that with our own words, by all means do so. If, on the other hand, we need guidance, and indeed most of us usually do, then you will find that the Siddur, the prayer book, has laid out a great many different passages to give that guidance. On this same theme, Rabbi Yaakov ben Meir rules that one may be creative with all 18 blessings, whether for words of thanks and praise or for one's needs, since one is merely extrapolating on the theme of the blessing. So he's saying that, yes, we have a laid out text, but if you need to adapt the words to your own expression, by all means do so. Since you are just using the theme, which is the most important part, and then finding your own words to share it. The same way that a painting instructor might ask the students to paint a rainbow, and then each student will paint the rainbow in their own way. Or, more powerfully, the same way a painting instructor might ask the students to paint a petition for justice, and would be, of course, expecting that each student would express that desire for justice in a different way on their own canvas. This is how our prayers work. We are trying to find our own expression within the theme that guides that expression. If one could not fulfill one's obligation through such changes, the sages should have recorded the text of the blessings and specified the exact number of words. So Rav Yom Tov is giving us a very good logical explanation that if you really thought that we only could be successful in our prayer and have done the commandment if we recited exactly, all of us, identically the same prayers at every service, then they would have been listed. Both God as well as our sages have no problem giving us long texts when necessary. And the fact that our sages did not give us long, precise texts for the content of the prayer, but instead more general themes and descriptions of length, shows that at their essence, it is about expressing more than about following a strict list of words. And in case you are wondering of whether it is okay to pray in a language other than Hebrew, all blessings may be said in any language, provided that they are said in the way the sages established them. So if you wish to say a blessing in English and Spanish and Russian, in any language that you understand, any language apart from Hebrew, that is fine. And in fact, it is preferable when praying alone to always speak in a language that you understand. Ultimately, it is about expressing yourself and allowing that expression to guide you to God. And if you do not know what you are saying, you will find that that activity does not have the same benefit. Obviously, learning Hebrew because of the great nuances and the great connection to our people and to our history is ideal. But in the meantime, as you work on Hebrew fluency, don't be afraid to use your own preferred language to express yourself. Questions or comments? All right, everybody's very quiet tonight, but that's okay. So now that we have a broad overview, let's get down into the nitty-gritty of the difference between prayer and blessing. So when we talk about prayer, what we are really talking about are different forms of expression of praise or expression of thanksgiving or expression of petition, and most often a mixture of all of those three. Praise, thanksgiving, and petition make up the essence of the Jewish prayer experience. Blessings, on the other hand, well, prayers will often include the blessing formula. But when we say a blessing in Judaism, we're using this as a technical form, as a very special form of acknowledgement of God in the world, where we are saying God is or God has, and then we fill in the blank according to the needs of the moment or situation. So we will say, blessed is the Redeemer. We will say, blessed is the one who commanded us to wrap in fringes, to wear a talit. Or blessed is the one who brings forth bread from the earth, the blessing we say before eating bread. All of these are a very special form of mindfulness, of focusing ourselves at the moment of an act or at the moment of expressing a prayer about this situation or topic. And thus, they follow a certain pattern in order to put us in that right frame of mind. And we will go over that in more detail. So let's talk about the broad types of prayer: praise, thanksgiving, and petition. So praise, well, many prayers will help us reflect upon God and to recognize God's greatness, whether it be as creator, helper, sustainer, redeemer, teacher, all-knowing, timeless, whatever it might be. This helps us frame our perspective. One of the most dangerous things about being a human is to recognize how amazing we are and forget that there is something more incredible than us. There is nothing wrong with taking pride in the place that humans occupy in the world and our amazing ability to shape our life and the world, but there is a great tendency towards arrogance. And by praising God, we are framing the relationship in a much better way. We are not saying that we are equal to God or, God forbid, superior to God, but that instead, God is beyond our understanding. This provides not only humility for us in our general life, but it also provides humility which will allow us to open up, to give thanks and gratitude, as well as petition, to ask God for what we need, as well as reflecting on what those needs should be. Thanksgiving, then, well, there are many prayers that are guiding us to help us appreciate God for all the things that we have: life, the blessings we have already received, the Torah, blessings of body and sight and life, whether we are wearing new clothes, the blessings of understanding. All of these things we recognize through the prayers of thanksgiving. All of these help us understand that we have already been gifted. Now, that thanksgiving then helps frame our gratitude, and together with our praise, it puts us in, like I said, that proper perspective, that proper understanding of our place in the world, one that is both insignificant as well as infinitely blessed already, to then put us into that relationship with God in the proper perspective. Which then brings us to petition. We have praised, we have given thanks, and then petition comes afterwards. We need to have the praise and the thanksgiving because, yes, we turn to God with our needs, but we have to be humble and acknowledge what we have already received. And in the process of doing this, and in the process of following the traditional form of our prayers, our requests are then shown to be that they should always be for true priorities in life. You don't usually find prayers in Jewish tradition that are praying that I be able to win the lottery. That's not the way that we would pray. We would pray instead that we, and indeed almost all Jewish prayers are in the communal form for all of us, meaning us and the world, that we should all have prosperity. Prosperity is not defined by having $1 million. Prosperity is defined as having enough to sustain ourselves. Our requests through our prayers are always joined to our own efforts. When we ask for God to help with prosperity, to continue that example, we are also reminding ourselves that we play an active role in this. That's why specifically we wouldn't just wish to win the lottery. Because God is not a genie that does everything for us. God is instead helping guide us through the spiritual act of prayer to recognize the opportunities and potential to bring about what is necessary, or to turn to other forms of assistance that will help us if we cannot do it on our own. And very importantly, our requests should never be for God to change what has already occurred. This is something that Jewish law discusses in great detail, that when we pray, we have to be sure that we are praying about what is coming, not what has occurred. The classic example is if somebody is coming over the hill, returning to their village, and there is smoke pouring up, you cannot pray, "Dear God, I hope it's not my house on fire," because whether it's your house on fire or not cannot be changed. It already is or isn't on fire. Instead, praying, "Dear God, I hope that everybody is okay," or "I hope that that we can put out that fire soon," that is talking about what comes next. So we have to remember, though, when we are praying in general, that there are certain limits on the way that we can pray, limits that are built in to the way God has designed the world and designed humanity. Right? Certain prayers simply cannot be answered in the way that we would expect them, because they are not possible with the plan of the world. If we wish and pray that Mashiach would come right now, and Mashiach doesn't, that doesn't mean that God doesn't agree with us that redemption should occur now. It doesn't mean that we are not worthy of having that prayer answered. It just means that it is not the right time globally, not just globally for this moment in this world, but for the entirety of all time for it to happen at this moment. Additionally, prayer sometimes cannot be answered because to do so would conflict with free will. To pray for somebody to fall in love with you is simply impossible, because God is not going to strip another person of their humanity in order to fulfill your wish. Prayer will often have to be obtained by our direct efforts. Again, going back to prosperity, simply sitting at home and wishing for a fortune is not going to be successful in Jewish thought. Instead, you have to get out there and work. Sometimes, as well, prayer has already been realized and we do not recognize it. That is one reason why praise and thanksgiving are such an important component of petition, because it sometimes will highlight for us that the thing we thought we were going to ask for has in fact already been given in a measure for which we should be thankful and for which we should not ask for more. I know during the last year, I have felt especially humbled by being able to have steady work and know that there was a roof over my family's head and food on the table, when so many others were thrown into uncertainty due to the economy impact from COVID-19. And for me to pray for greater personal wealth would just be the height of grief, given what others are struggling with. And by having thanksgiving, by praising God, it puts me in a position to understand and reflect on that better. And also sometimes prayers have to go unanswered because to give them to us would actually be harmful to us. Sometimes the best answer we can hope for is no. We may not understand, we may not like that answer, we may never fully comprehend in this life why that answer was the best one for us. And that doesn't mean that we should give up on something that we know is legitimately worthwhile. But it does mean that sometimes, right now, is not the right time. And we have to be prepared for that in a way that is meant to protect us rather than to harm us. For example, if you are trying to get to a job interview and you get into a small fender bender and now you are late and you miss the interview and you don't get the job, you may curse your luck, but it could be that that particular job would have brought you pain and misery and suffering, and the small fender bender was actually a blessing in disguise, if you will. In the interest of time, we are going to skip the wonderful quote here from Einstein. I'll leave it up on the screen. Hopefully you can hit pause and you can read it at your leisure. All right, so let's talk more about how prayer works on us. That is to say, Jewish belief is that prayer is a combination of a bodily act and a soulful act. It is not a pure soul activity. It is not, of course, a pure bodily activity. So in order for our prayer to be working well, we need to, first of all, prepare ourselves physically. That means we need to be free of distractions. We need to make sure that we're not standing near bad smells, that we're not standing near noises, if avoidable, and that we are not going to be interrupted. Put this on silent unless you are awaiting a very important call that must be answered for someone's life. By separating ourselves from these things, we allow our body not to constantly push us away from the spiritual moment we are seeking. For many of our prayers, you will also find that we stand, we bow, we take steps forward and back, we lift ourselves on our toe. There's a complicated choreography, all of which is explained in the current Siddur we use, Lev Shalem, and many others as well. And we do this because it allows us to have a guided imagery of being in the presence of royalty. Now, that may not be as inspiring to everybody these days, and I understand that. But if you were to think of yourself as standing before a true king, and one that you respected and honored, and treated with the proper shows of respect, you would then recognize that God would be deserving of the same, and our bodily actions elicit that from within us. One of the most profound discoveries of psychology over the last hundreds of years is that how we move and act often changes how we feel. Of course, this has been wisdom in Judaism and many other traditions for a long time, but it is nice to have the confirmation of modern science. And that means how we treat ourselves during prayer and how we act during prayer is a very important component and not merely meaningless custom. And when it comes time for our soul, we need preparation as well. Jumping in, if you are very short on time, of course, that is possible, but it is not ideal. Instead, taking a moment to breathe, to separate ourselves from whatever it was we were doing before our prayer, to give our body, our mind a chance to quiet and still and be steady. This is an important part of getting the most from the experience. We then concentrate on the words and their meaning, as well as how they reflect our own thoughts. Much like an actor who is giving a performance of Shakespeare, reads the words that are written by Shakespeare, but in a way that reflects how they are trying to convey the feelings of the character. So too, when we read the words, even though they may be the same or similar words to those around us and those who have come before us for thousands of years, we should be thinking about them as our words. What do they mean from me at this moment, at this time? And day to day, moment to moment, those feelings can change. Sometimes when we are thanking God for the gift of understanding, it may be with a specific insight that we have just had in mind that we are expressing gratitude. Other times we may be struggling to understand something, and that blessing of God as the giver of understanding will have more of a petitionary feeling than a gratitude. There's many different ways to feel on all of the different prayers, and each one of us needs to find those as we go through. And of course, we pace ourselves through the service to hit the moments of greatest focus with the right spirit. The service itself is orchestrated much like a very good workout session in order to move you through a warm-up, through the hardest parts, and then with a cool down, so that spiritually we are awakening ourselves to our highest point when it is most needed. And with that in mind, let's take a look at the basic structure of prayer. So there are two main parts of tefillah, of prayer in general. There is the Shema and its blessings, and there is the Amidah. Now the Shema, a very special phrase from Deuteronomy, is one that we are commanded to recite twice each day. And each time we recite it in a prayer service, it is accompanied by prayers, each of which have similar themes, both in the morning and evening service, to put us into that right focus along with the Shema and its message. The Amidah, which is the very famous set of 19 prayers, this is the core of our obligation to pray, and this is the one that is usually referred to as being most similar to the sacrificial services that we talked about at the beginning. So talking about the Shema and the Ve'ahavta first, when we look at the Shacharit, the morning service, we can see that the prayers follow themes that go from creation, revelation, relationship, which is the Shema portion, and then redemption. Now, in particular, the way that these different topics are encountered in our prayers, we focus in the morning on thanking God for the gift of light as sort of the touchstone of creation. In the evening, we thank God for darkness. When it comes time for revelation, we focus on God's love, that God cared enough to share revelation, meaning the Torah, with us. When it comes time for the relationship, we are really focused on the covenant, the brit, the bond between us and God. Again, this is seen in the Shema. And then when the act of redemption that we are speaking of, we are recognizing God's faithfulness in the past and God's faithfulness to a future form of redemption for ourselves in the world. Now, all of this fits together in a very carefully constructed pattern. If you will allow me to sort of walk you through one way to look at the emotional progression of this section. So creation, as I mentioned, puts us in the proper frame of mind of simply recognizing God as creator, of marveling at the gift of creation and life that we are in, but it also puts us into a moment of confusion, a moment where we need explanation. Creation is overwhelming. That feeling of awe that we have when you see a huge mountain or stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon or watch an ocean stretch off into infinity, that demands a little bit more guidance. And indeed, God gave us that guidance through the Torah, through revelation. When we see then that revelation allows us to understand creation and our place within it and the direction of creation, then together that understanding leads us to then appreciate our relationship to God. God created the world and created us and created instructions, the Torah, so that we would know our place in this world and come to recognize God, to be able to be in relationship with God through that connection of creation and revelation. And then, once we understand creation and revelation and the relationship that we have to God through all of this, then we recognize both the redemption in the past as well as the future. Then we can understand that through us living up to our relationship with God as guided through the Torah and implemented in the world as created, then redemption, the creation of the world into a perfect reflection of God's will for humanity in this existence, that is possible. We see the example of that in the past with the redemption from Egypt, and we are anticipating the future when that type of redemption and end to physical suffering caused by each other will become the norm for us and for everyone. And by having it in this particular order, by constructing it through creation, revelation, relationship, and redemption, it puts us on a certain track that allows for insights that would not be as easily attained if we didn't have the guidance of this ordered service. Before we jump into Berachot, the specific blessings we say at different times and occasions, any questions about that summary of the structure of prayer? Okay. So, as I mentioned, Berachot are specific moments of reflection, of mindfulness, of awareness that are included both with prayers as well as standalone declarations at different moments of life. All of them are characterized by 6 starting words. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Translated, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the world. Now, each of these words has significance that needs to be understood each time we go through them. Excuse me. Blessed. When we say blessed is God, we are not saying that God is lucky. We are instead saying that God is the source of blessing. that all blessing comes from God. When we address God as Ata, as you, we are directing ourselves to God very personally. We are not talking about God, we are talking to God. And then when we reflect on God with Adonai, we are reflecting on the four-letter name of God. Now, this four-letter name of God is a source of great mystery and deep understanding, but for the moment, simply reflect upon it as being the name of God, which most accurately represents God's essence and the essence of all of existence that is due to God. So we are speaking not just to a God, like some pagan deity, we are speaking to and through this veil of existence to the source of everything and everything beyond even our understanding. So you can't speak to something greater than this, and yet God has invited us to speak directly. And then we reflect our God, that Adonai not only exists, we're not only talking to this essence behind which created all of the universe, but that this existence has called to us to relationship, to reconnect, and that is reflected by us choosing to allow God to be our God. Melech HaOlam, right? God is not only our God, meaning not only the God of our people, but also the God of the whole world. And this also means, of course, back to our beginning, that God is the source of all blessing. So these 6 words have much more to say than just this, but hopefully that will at least get you moving in the right direction when you say them. So we say blessings for different occasions, whether we are eating something or whether we are seeing something or whether we are experiencing things, as a way of marking the time. The way that a modern person might just walk through life, really not taking a moment to appreciate or to reflect on any given activity, whether it be shoving food in your mouth or whether it be recognizing something that's beautiful, is quite startling. Our sages said, no, you need to stop and not smell the rose, but acknowledge the rose. It's not merely enough to take from the world and to experience the world. You must be aware that you are experiencing the world and what that experience represents beyond just that tiny slice. This is a way of injecting infinity into even the most simple and mundane tasks, for example, eating. Now, all of these phrases here, you'll see are introduced by ... That means we recite the six words of Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam, and then we continue with Hamotzi Lechem Min Haaretz, which is the blessing we say before eating bread. So we would translate the whole thing to being, blessed are you, Lord our God, who brings forth bread from the earth. And then we would be able to eat. So too, if you are about to drink a cup of wine, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam, Borei Peri Hagafen. And if we are eating something else, there are different lists of blessings to be recited over food from the trees and food from the ground. But for a most generic statement over different food, or if the origin isn't known, or if you haven't memorized the other blessings yet, we say Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Shehakol Yeh Bidvaro. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word all things come into being. That is the most broad description of the food. Now, if you want more information and instruction, I can show you the more complete lists. But just understand that we have blessings as well for occasions, whether it be seeing something like lightning, and we would say, Osei Ma'aseh Bereshit, that God is the creator of the act of creation, which is saying that lightning is part of creation. It's not something to be afraid of. It is not something to think of as being a representation of anger. This is part of the created world. Or if we see something of great beauty, we would say, Shekachalo be'olamo, that amazing that God has such as this, something as beautiful as this in his world. I apologize for the typo there. And when something is terrible, when we receive bad news, for example, the news of a death, we would say, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam Dayan HaEmet. we still recognize, we still acknowledge that God is a true judge. We do not understand why the tragedy happened at that moment, but we do not believe it is due to an absence of God, but instead for some reason that is beyond our understanding at the moment. We also say blessings when we are about to perform a commandment. However, when we are performing a commandment, we add an additional phrase into our formula. So we would say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu, and then fill in the blank. This new phrase means that God has made us holy with his commandments and commanded us to next page. So what are we telling ourselves to be mindful of at this moment? That we have been made holy, but we have been made holy due to the commandments, that our mundane actions, lighting candles, become something sacred, become something amazing when we are doing them as a commandment. That something as simple as putting on a cloak with fringes becomes something transformative spiritually when we do it with the mindfulness of a commandment. And that is a gift, that God has given us a way to make ourselves and our life holy by having given us the commandments. That transforms things that we might have done anyway, or things that might have not carried much significance for us, into amazing moments of spiritual reflection and growth when done with this awareness. Indeed, it is through the commandments and because we are commanded that the holiness is added. And the tzivanu, and commanded us, this is then introducing the commandment that we are about to focus on. For example, if we are about to eat bread, we do the washing of the hands first, and we would say, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al netilat yadayim, who has commanded us concerning the raising of the hands. If you are about to attach a mezuzah on the doorpost of a house, and if you need more information or help with that, please let me know. I do make house calls, although wearing masks at the moment. We would say the same introduction concluded with likboa mezuzah, that God has commanded us to affix the mezuzah on our doorposts of our house. And so too for all of the other blessings of commandedness, that this gives us a moment, as I said earlier, to stop, to quiet our mind, to take that breath, to think about what we are about to do, to reflect on it through the blessing itself and the structure that we are given, and then actually perform the deed. If we perform the deed without all of this, yes, you have still done the deed, of course, and that's great, and certainly it's better to do than not do, but you've missed the opportunity. The same way that you might just say I love you to your spouse when they are going off to work sometime, and not actually think about it, but be instead thinking about your own day, your own schedule, and what comes next. But if you take a moment, stop, and say I love you as they are heading out the door, you will find it a much more fulfilling experience, and one that reinforces and deepens the relationship, not just at that moment, but as an additive effect, as a building effect. And so too, God wanted to make sure that we would pause at different moments in our life, whether it be feeding our face or whether it be performing commandments, and make sure that we were doing it in a way that would best serve us, that would actually fulfill our spiritual and religious needs, rather than simply going through the actions like a machine. Because God did not make us a machine. If he wanted machines, he could have. But instead, he made us people that had a potential to grow far beyond what any strict automaton could ever have achieved. Any questions before we wrap it up for tonight? As I said, this is only the tip of the iceberg. There are so many other prayers and details to learn. Please, if you are using our Lev Shalem, which you should have digital copies of because of COVID, please use the commentary. Read through the different insights that are there. More understanding than you might be able to achieve just on your own. If you have other questions, please be in touch. Always happy to discuss. Rabbi. All right, everyone. Take care and have a great evening.
Thank you, Rabbi.